Carrie was released in 1976 and was the first movie to adapt a Stephen King story. It follows a shy teenage girl who faces the stresses of being a girl, an overbearing mother, and being the subject of bullying. We find out that Carrie has telekinetic abilities. Stephen King wrote the story because a woman challenged him on his inability to write female characters. He wanted to prove her wrong, so he wrote the infamous bathroom scene. Thinking it was bad, he threw it in the trash. His wife picked it up later and told him to go forth and write the rest of the novel. This movie was directed by Brian De Palma and stars Sissy Spacek. Hey guys, welcome to Garage Stephen-King-a-thon, where we revisit a Stephen King movie for every day of October. Today's movie is Carrie, which, in my opinion, is the best Stephen King movie adaptation. Now that's a controversial opinion probably because there are plenty of great directors out there who have directed Stephen King stories like Stanley Kubrick and Rob Reiner. But to me, Brian De Palma's Carrie is a masterclass in horror filmmaking. Let's start by talking about that infamous bathroom scene, that infamous shower scene. So this movie deals with the theme of misogyny. As I said in the introduction, someone challenged Stephen King, told him that he lacked the ability to make female characters. And so he decided to make a very, one might say, feminist film. Even though this movie is directed by a male director and written by a male writer, the film feels very feminist. So the movie opens with that shower scene, and one might criticize that shower scene for being too sexual. It's sexualizing young teenage girls, which is kind of the point of the movie. It sets the theme up of the film. This movie is objectifying women just as society, and especially Carrie's society, is objectifying her. She then gets her first period, she is unaware of what it is, and then she is bullied by her classmates. So it sets the tone. We know that Carrie is this shy girl who's very unaware of her surroundings because she leads a very sheltered life with her mother, and she is the subject of ridicule with her classmates. And just that perfect scene, that one scene alone, shows you every aspect that this movie is going to explore. Carrie is a very sheltered individual, showing that her mother is overbearing, and shows the pressures that religion has on women. Meanwhile, this scene also demonstrates this bad culture that goes on in high school, this bullying culture that's very predominant with women as well. We think of bullying as a more male thing, giving wedgies and stealing lunch money and stuff like that, while in fact bullying is a lot more complex than that, and this is what this movie shows well. Yes, bullying does happen with men, but it happens with girls in high school as well. Gossip, poking fun, name-calling, and that's all the pressures that Carrie explores. The pressures from her religion and her mother, the pressures from her classmates. That's why this movie has a very feminist, a very anti-misogynist message. And I think that's what I like the most. That's what makes Carrie stand out from other Stephen King horror movies, is the fact that even though the horror is very tame and subdued, much like what I think are the best Stephen King horror movies, there's a clear message there that you can grasp onto. In an era where we seem to be promoting themes of misogyny in film, I feel like no other film does it quite as good as Carrie, at least not in recent memory. Talking about the more stylistic approach of Brian De Palma, for those of you who don't know Brian De Palma is one of the directors that came out of the new Hollywood movement, aka the Hollywood Renaissance. What is the Hollywood Renaissance? It's a movement that started in the late 60s or early 70s and made its way through the mid-80s. Meanwhile, in the mid-60s in France and in Italy, they were having their own film movements, their own new wave movements. We think of the French new wave movement, how we had directors like Godard, and in Italy we had directors like Fellini, and that carried over to America. We got filmmakers like George Lucas, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola, and Brian De Palma, who were all influenced by that new wave movement that was going on in Hollywood. So De Palma borrows a lot of that artistic flair that was going on in the new Hollywood movement. He also borrows a lot from Alfred Hitchcock. If you guys have ever seen an Alfred Hitchcock movie, you would know that he is the master of suspense. And this movie is a very suspenseful movie. You look at that prom scene, that infamous prom scene, and it seems to be dragged out so long, and you know what the outcome is going to be. You know something terrible is going to go on, and you're just waiting for something to happen, and you're on the edge of your seat. That was very reminiscent of an Alfred Hitchcock movie. That's what Alfred Hitchcock did very well when he would make his movies. He would drag that suspense. He would put you on the edge of your seat. He would have you chopping at your nails, just like, oh, fuck, something's gonna go down. That's what Alfred Hitchcock does well, and Brian De Palma borrows a lot of those beats from Alfred Hitchcock. That's shown not only through the suspense that he builds, also the soundtrack. Brian De Palma wanted Bernard Herrmann to do the score of this movie, but unfortunately Bernard Herrmann passed away. Now, Bernard Herrmann was Alfred Hitchcock's go-to composer. He composed the classic score of Psycho, but unfortunately he passed away before he can do Carrie. But when you listen to the Carrie soundtrack, there's a lot of beats that copy Psycho, and while De Palma says it's unintentional, I don't think it is, but I think it's more of an homage to Psycho. He liked that score that seemed to amplify the horror, that score that would create tension. It was very Bernard Herrmann-esque. Even down to the poster of this film. The poster of this film feels very Alfred Hitchcock. The poster of the film reads, "If you have a taste for horror, take Carrie to the prom." A very meta, a very tongue-in-cheek horror quote that seems to be very attention-grabbing to get people in the theater. That's something Alfred Hitchcock used to do on his posters. Some of his movie posters, I'm thinking of The Birds in Mine, legit had him in front on the poster standing with a quote that was something along the lines of that. So influences from the New Hollywood movement, influences from Alfred Hitchcock. What else influenced Brian De Palma? This is one that I really couldn't find on the internet, but I feel like there's a little bit of giallo cinema going on in this movie. For those of you who don't know giallo cinema, I know I'm just throwing all these film movements at you. So giallo cinema, it started in comic books actually, and it started out of Italy. In Italy, they would make comic books, but they had very limited resources and didn't have much color to use when it came to inking and colorizing the comics. So instead, they would use these very bright colors to compensate for it. That started a bit of a film movement where horror movies especially would have these bright colors thrown into it. One of the most prolific giallo cinema directors was Dario Argento, who made the original Suspiria, Opera, Inferno, and all of these classic horror movies. They had very good use of color. And Brian De Palma has gone on record saying that giallo cinema has influenced some of his movies, but he didn't say it specifically about Carrie, so I just want to put that disclaimer out. I feel like there was a bit of a giallo influence on Carrie. The film starts off as very dour, and Carrie's life is pretty miserable, and you feel bad for her. And then what Brian De Palma does is that he starts building her up. This guy asks her out to the prom, her life seems to be going well, the music becomes a lot more cheerful, and then all of a sudden, that prom scene, Brian De Palma is just waiting, and he's waiting to pull the carpet from under Carrie. And when it happens, that whole prom sequence is such a beautiful... Guys, it's a masterclass in filmmaking. All you aspiring filmmakers out there, watch the prom scene from Carrie on a loop. From the beginning to the end. It's a long sequence, but it really shows how you build tension. There's that shot of Carrie dancing with her boyfriend, and the camera's just spinning around them as they talk, and it spins faster and faster and faster. That poor cameraman must have been a little nauseated, but that camera trick shows that you're just waiting for something to go wild. And then when shit does hit the fan, when the bucket of blood falls on Carrie, the horror seems to be a little more abstract than your usual horror movie, where flashes of lights happen, you're kind of seeing through the perspective of Carrie, the imagery becomes a lot more hallucinogenic, and the sound of the mother is repeated. They're all gonna laugh at you! They're all gonna laugh at you! It feels very dreamlike. I remember when I was in high school and when I'd fuck up or when I'd get bullied or when I was put on the spot in a very embarrassing situation, that's the emotion that went through me. Like, I'd feel all the blood escape my head and go into my body, and I'd feel lightheaded, and things just seemed a little dizzy. And then Carrie comes back with a vengeance. It goes into a split-screen camera mode. We see Carrie use her telekinetic abilities to wipe out everyone in some gruesome ways. Again, one of that split-screen camera trickery is one reason why I think there was a giallo cinema influence on Brian De Palma. It felt very comic book-like. So that's how Brian De Palma made one of the greatest horror movies. He made it a very dour movie with a lot of influence from his surroundings, a lot of influence from popular film movements at the time, which he blends them so masterfully in this movie, and I think that's why I think this movie is so interesting. Many other Hollywood new wave directors loved this movie. Martin Scorsese, for one, went to see this movie in the cinema 3 times when this movie came out, which is pretty cool. And other directors have quoted Carrie as saying it's one of the greatest all-time horror movies. I remember seeing a quote from Quentin Tarantino who said that Carrie is one of his favorite horror movies. That's why it's really masterfully done. While this movie is very terrifying, there are some comedic elements in this film, and those usually come from the characters played by John Travolta and Nancy Allen. I was reading up on this film, and apparently Nancy Allen and John Travolta felt like this was a dark comedy. And you can look at this movie through a darkly comedic lens. It does feel very dark comedy-esque, but Brian De Palma actually had to take Nancy Allen aside because she kept laughing during the shoot, and he had to tell her, listen, this isn't a comedy, stop laughing, which is pretty funny in itself. The cinematography in this movie is so beautiful. One shot in particular that I feel goes unnoticed, there's this scene where Carrie is talking to her mother at a dinner table, and there's nothing but candlelight. And Carrie proposes that she wants to go to the prom. Her mother throws a glass of water at her, extinguishing the candle. And once that happens, the tone of the scene becomes darker, but the set becomes darker as well. And the only thing illuminating it are flashes of lightning coming from outside. I feel like the very end of this movie gets overshadowed by that prom sequence. Yes, that prom sequence is some of the best cinema ever, but the way this movie concludes is equally as satisfying in my opinion. We find out that Carrie was born from sex out of wedlock. She is the product of sin, and her mother views her as that, and that's why her mother thinks she has telekinetic abilities. She tries to kill Carrie, but Carrie kills her before she has the chance to. And when the mother dies, she dies in a Jesus-like pose with her hands stabbed to the walls, which again goes with that dark comedic element of the film. There's a little dramatic irony in that very end of the film, which is why I think the conclusion is so perfect to this film. So yeah, I just spilt my guts out. I told you why Carrie is one of the all-time great horror movies ever. It is probably my favorite Stephen King horror movie. But guys, stay tuned. I might like other Stephen King movies more as I rewatch them, but as it stands now and from my memories, I remember thinking Carrie is the best Stephen King horror movie. Kind of a shame it's the first movie here on Garage Stephen-King-a-thon, but I'm going in chronological order because I like seeing the evolution. So yeah, watch Carrie if you haven't, and I feel like it's one of those Stephen King adaptations. A lot of the times people are going to criticize a Stephen King adaptation for not being faithful to the book. This Stephen King adaptation had Stephen King's blessing, and he even said it was a step up over his book. So if you guys are looking for a Stephen King movie and you haven't seen all of them, I suggest you watch Carrie. It's probably the best one.
You have a date with Carrie.